everyone, and you may recognize me, Reverend Robert Cook, and Reverend Dr. Joanne Mercer from other preaching series that we've done here at Queen's College. But this year we're taking a kind of a different approach to our Lenten series, and we're talking about reading the Lenten readings from an artistic perspective, or with the eyes of an artist. And so our series is called Of Dust and Light. And so over the Lenten season, we're going to be joined by a bunch of different artists who do all kinds of wonderful creative things like paint and sculpt and write and act, and all just going to be wonderful, wonderful conversations. And we're so very excited to have our good friend with us today, Ruth Major, coming to us all the way from BC. Now, for local people, that's not behind Carbonear. She's actually in British Columbia, joining us through the wonders of technology. So before we get going, I'm going to ask Ruth if she would kind of just say a little bit about herself, where she's coming from, the kind of artist that she is, and how wonderful we are too.
Hi, I'm Ruth Major, and as somebody actually asked me the other day, so what kind of art do you do? It was in class because I attend Emily Carr. I do and have done a bit of everything. I label myself, I'm a printmaker, I'm a photographer, I'm a painter, I'm a sculptor, I knit, I embroider, I basically do everything. Or I've tried almost everything, because for me, it's about the adventure of trying different things so that I can learn something new about what I want to create and what I want to do, who I want to meet, what kind of conversation I want to be in. That's kind of the artwork I do. I do lots, and I always have fun. And I'm Vancouver, BC, which is great. And also I want to just show you, see, this is all my artwork behind me, including the big one there, Carlita, my Atlantic cod. It's very cool.
Now, Ruth, you're originally from Newfoundland, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Oh, yes, I should say that. Originally, I was born in St. John's. I've actually, ironically enough, my brothers, 3 of them, and my dad still are in St. John's. And I go to visit twice a year. I just came back, love the December with no snow. Now I talked to my dad this morning. He just spent an hour and a half with a snowblower because you guys got so much more snow. Sorry, in Vancouver, although I'm ironic, they are predicting snow for us next week. Which I will believe it when I see it. I really will believe it when I see it, because a week in advance, they're giving us the forecast. I don't believe
it. So the way we do this, Ruth, is when we start our conversation, because you're our guest, we always let our guests go first and kind of set the tone for the rest of the conversation. We were doing a little warm-up before we hit record, and if we touch on half of what we talked about before we started recording, this is going to be a very interesting conversation. So I'm going to throw it over to Ruth to kind of get us going. So Ruth, in these readings, and in particular, you know, we tend to focus on the reading from the Hebrew scriptures and the gospel, but these are two very powerful, foundational, stories from the Christian and the Hebrew tradition. So in these readings, kind of what jumps out at you as an artist?
I actually never, the whole Adam and Eve story, it always fascinated me, because I always wondered whether or not they were real. And we talked about whether or not the whole idea about painting them, or painting the image of the serpent and the piece of fruit that everyone sort of talks about and things like that. And I said, I wouldn't actually paint Adam and Eve. I don't know what they look like, so I would have a problem painting them, because I'm showing my assumptions would be completely crazy. But I would do the fruit. And how I would do the fruit, would probably be different. I would probably do a bunch of different, I'm doing a painting at the moment that was actually, the image was printed onto canvas, and I'm embroidering that onto that canvas. I'm painting onto that canvas. I like collage. So I would probably take stuff from different pieces of my world, from everything from perhaps magazines or anything like that, and computer generated images, just to see what the fruit would look like. And I would probably do it a color that's not of a fruit color. I would probably do it blue.
So why would you focus on the fruit?
Because I think the whole idea about eating something and then all of a sudden it's a bad thing, that because you've eaten this fruit, that everyone's, oh, you can't eat that fruit, then everything goes to heck in a handbasket. Like, because of that whole,
You can say
I can
help.
say that, oh, goes to hell in a handbasket. And I mean, and the poor fruit is just sitting there going, I'm not part of this conversation, but apparently because you ate me, now everything's gone to hell in a handbasket. And that assumption of what is important, like the Adam and Eve story, like what is really important? Is it the fruit? Is it Adam? Is it Eve? And it's the assumptions about what we think of of Eve as the woman, and the downfall of Adam, quote unquote. And we don't know. Like, I mean, Adam could have just looked at that fruit and go, doesn't look very good. I don't want it. So he turns to Eve and goes, you try it, hun. Like so many other things, right? Like, oh no, I don't want to eat that, hun. You can try it and tell me what it tastes like.
I mean, yeah, I think you really you hit on kind of what's so great about that, in particular the Genesis reading, but also what's a little bit dangerous about the Genesis reading
Yes.
is that you really can, there's so many different ways to read it,
To interpret it.
or
Oh yeah.
to imagine it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like so often we put our own stuff,
Yeah.
baggage, ideas into that story when and read things into it that aren't necessarily there.
No, no, because and also we've heard the story. I mean, I'm over 50, and my dad is Canon Carl Major, and I have been, as I tell people, I've been born into the church. So my dad was a priest before I was born. I actually was born into that church. So I have heard these stories for 50 plus years. And every time I hear the story, I think of something completely different, right? Like, what is my assumptions and all of that kind of stuff. So you hear them and you assume things. You assume, oh, this was happened and this happened and that happened. And how you interpret it, how you interpret anything, right? How you interpret, even, I mean, we were talking about color theory the other day. One of the students, oh my gosh, Skylar, loves doing color theory. That's what she wants to specialize in, is color theory. And she did these amazing abstract paintings with all these different shapes of different colors. And we all kind of looked and we all had assumptions about, okay, how did you create, we actually asked, how did you create that color? And how, and she was saying, I'm having problems painting a color. Like, how do I get that color, the color I want? So it was interesting how we think, the interpretation, oh, I like that color, I don't like that color, all of that kind of stuff, and how do we make it, and assumptions that we have about how we make those things, and how we believe those things too, right? Whether or not we believe the Adam and Eve story and the spiritualization.
It's funny, Ruth, because like for those of us who aren't artists, I really wouldn't think about how do I make a color.
Yeah.
Like, I pick out a color, or yeah, but I mean, and I'm sure even with novelists, like they make a story. And when we read particularly that Genesis story, I think we read it, story's been, I like what you said, like you've heard it, story's been made before we read it.
Yeah.
And so often what we read is not actually what's in the text.
Yeah.
But what we expect to find in the text. Like when we were chatting earlier, you talked about the apple, and I said, well, actually there's no apple in the passage. It doesn't say it's an apple. We all have seen the paintings of the apple. We assume it's an apple, but I'm not sure the apples are native to that area of the world.
They grow in the Middle East.
Yeah, so it's very likely not an apple. probably a pomegranate or something like that would be more normal.
Mhm.
You know, we read it as people will call it the story of the fall, but the word fall is not in the story, or the story of original sin.
Mhm.
Sin is not in
Not
the
in the story.
story. Like, so we have all these things have already made the color of
Mhm.
that story
Oh, yeah.
before we've read it.
Yeah.
And I think that's really sort of interesting for us to sort of, I like the question you asked your friend, like, what color, how did you make that? Like, what went into making us all these assumptions we have
Mhm.
about the color of that story, right?
Yeah.
All the things that we assume about that story that prevents us
Mhm.
from seeing it new. So as we
Yeah.
start this first Sunday of Lent to journey towards the resurrection, towards the feast of Easter, if we want to make this a new journey, like how do we begin to see that story in a new way? And how do we filter out, I guess, all the things that we presume about that story that's
Exactly.
probably not there and not helpful,
No.
not helpful to our
Yeah.
spiritual journey, because we automatically think that we're, well, for me, I'll give you some things I layer onto it. I'm not gonna, you know, we layer like this notion of sin, right? That we are all created sinful.
Mhm.
And I was saying to Robert yesterday when we were getting ready to set up the call with you, is that, you know, to me, the biggest thing, the new thing in this story for me in reading it, is to not sort of look at it as sin, but um to look at it in terms of doubt, and the sort of notion that we are not enough, right? Somehow the serpent taps into this notion, like fed this notion within Eve, that who she was and what she had wasn't sufficient,
Mhm.
wasn't enough. Um, and to me, it's like the biggest lie we deal with in our culture, in this lie of consumerism, right?
Yeah.
If you have this one thing, you will be enough,
Yeah.
right? You know, if you buy this one thing, if you consume this one thing, if you
Or you,
change this one thing about
or
yourself,
you have how many
whatever.
friends, like how many
Hmm?
friends you have on Facebook? Like, oh my God, I want 5,000 friends on Facebook. Oh my God, I want 10,000 friends or I want my Twitter followings. I want millions of people to follow me. All of that kind of things about it's going to, well, the other thing is it's going to make me feel better, quote unquote, right? Is it going to really make you feel better? Or is it that whole idea of, like you were saying, is it enough? What is enough? I mean, how many of us, you know, are following the whole idea about fast fashion and what it's doing to our environment? And the designers that are every season, they're throwing stuff out into the garbage, and all of that kind of stuff. All of our, it's our throwaway. We've got a throwaway culture, right? You wear it once, oh my gosh, I don't like it, I'll just throw it away. Or I, you know, I want new shoes, but my other shoes were just fine, I just wanted a new color. And at what point do you realize I have way too much stuff? Like I have way too much stuff and I don't need to be buying any more stuff because it's not helping the environment. It's not helping, really, to be honest, not helping our souls. And it's not, it's just, yeah, we're buying into that. We need more stuff to make ourselves feel better.
And can I agree with what Joanne's saying, but can I take it one step further?
Oh,
I would say that a lot of religion does the exact same thing,
mm,
right? It tells us we're not enough. It tells
mhm,
us that's something missing. And what's missing is belonging to this particular group, or, you know, having membership in a church, or, you know, right? It says that there's something missing it. But I would say this myth that we're separated from God, right? And that the only way to get reconnected is to do A, B, C, or D, or to,
or
you know,
to
that's
or to attend a church this way. I mean, because, well, I mean, during COVID, everyone's been, quote, really lonely. And I said to somebody, I said, I felt, I mean, I've been lonely because I live alone, but I said, I've never felt alone. I've always felt the presence of God. I've always, ever since I've been a young child. And for me, that's enough. Like, I don't need to belong to a certain parish. I don't need to belong to whatever, right? Because I feel that I am enough,
Mm.
you know,
It,
that
it reminds me of a quote from Richard Rohr. I love Richard Rohr, and I know some people don't really care for him, but
I never heard of him. So go
he
for
has
it.
he has this great line from his most recent book, I think, The Universal Christ, because he says, "I am never separate from God, nor could I ever be,
Yeah.
except in my mind."
That's true.
Right, and I think that, to me, that's the root of what's going on in this particular story, right? That idea of doubt, right?
Mhm.
Or I would even say identity. If we read
Mm.
this story, and I think the gospel story too of the temptation, read it through the question, which might sound odd, but read it through the question, who are we?
Yeah.
Who are we together? Who are we with God? Right?
Mhm.
And I think that's what, especially the Genesis story, but I think the
Yeah.
gospel story too, is getting at that idea. Who are we?
Yeah.
And I think in the gospel story, you're seeing Jesus struggle with that himself, right?
Mhm.
I'm not sure that that gospel scene actually ever happened, but it happened certainly in the psychology of Jesus himself,
Yeah.
right? Who am I? And trying to make sense of who he's becoming, even, right?
And it's the whole idea about, what do I have to prove? I mean, Jesus didn't, I mean, the whole idea about the temptation of Jesus, fall down off this very high hill or high building, and the angels will save you. And, or make this stone into bread, right? I mean, it's that whole idea of the temptation, right?
And when I would say, when couldn't you say, or I'm going to say, that that's the radicalness of the good news of Jesus Christ. That's the heart of the gospel, is that we are not separate from God, that we are created in the image of God, as a reminder. And lately I've been, much to Robert's consternation, been quoting N.T. Wright, but N.T. Wright, in his The Day the Revolution Began, he talks about the human vocation, right, as being to reflect, to understand ourselves as being created in the image of God, and to reflect God's grace and wonder and glory, like, to the whole world, and to worship God, like, in doing that, to provide worship to God. That is, in anything else we do is idolatry, because we're not who we're supposed to be. And we're giving, by like consumerism, that we're giving that power and authority and wonder and joy to something other than God. And while I mightn't agree with him in lots of other things, I do agree with him on this. And I think it's kind of hard for us to appreciate how simple that is,
Mhm.
right? How simple it is that that Genesis story is not about women being seductress and evil. It's not about, serpents tempting us. It's not about a power struggle between men and women. It's about feeling we need to separate ourselves from God, that we can't. Because right after this story, they're going to hide from God, right? They're going to be ashamed and hide from God. And that's sort of almost what we've been doing for millennia since, right?
Mhm.
Is that somehow, if God knows who we are, that God's not going to love us, right? And
Mm.
then we get ourselves into some really complicated, unhealthy theology of ways in which we make our salvation a math equation, right? I like, if I sin X amount, God needs to love me Y to equal zero, and we got to sort of figure out a way to make this, and when I think it's a lie.
Mhm.
But I mean, I think yeah, and that idea that the mathematics of it, right? our relationship with God is not an accounting problem.
No.
Right? But
That's when I checked. No.
look at the theories of atonement that we use, and I'm not going to get bogged down in all that stuff, but a lot of them, and certainly the most predominant one over the last 1,000 years or so, is very
2000.
transactional, right? It's very transactional,
Mm.
right? We owe a debt that we can't pay, so
Mhm.
that Jesus then becomes the substitution for us, and he pays that debt
Mhm.
for us, right? I mean, but what that does to us, so we're all these groveling people who,
Mhm.
God can't look at us because we're so sinful. I mean, it's just a very messed up theology, right? But if we read this text, the Genesis story, through that lens of remembering who we are, right? That we're made in God's image, that the Spirit has been breathed into us, that we have been made for community with each other, in solidarity with each other, right? Look how fast they turn on each other, right? But we're made to be in community with each other. We're made to be in community with God. And to add to what Joanne was saying, like in the next scene, they hide from God. But as the scene shifts from the garden out into the world, when they're kicked out, God doesn't stay in the garden, right? God goes along with them and journeys with them.
Mhm.
So this idea that we're separate from God, I think, is a dangerous idea.
Yeah, and also the whole idea about separation and how we, like you were saying, desperately need to connect to God, and what we have to quote pay to do that is what is also very very problematic, because I don't think God really cares about 20,000, 20 million Twitter followers and all that kind of stuff. I just don't think he really cares, and
About who wins the hockey game?
yeah, well, I don't know, that's a really important thing.
But yeah, I mean, and I think you could easily look at those gospel temptations as transsexual notions as well, right? That they are they're sort of very much, if you do this, this will happen, right?
Yes.
And it's that sort of rejection of that nature of relationship with God. And I mean, the incarnation is in of itself a rejection of that relationship with God. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that God became one of us.
Mhm.
That God, it's relational, not transactional, right? And that's really still very hard for us to see that color, to see what goes into that color. We're much more comfortable with the color of sin and transaction than we are this color of grace and original blessing and
Yeah, because sin, everyone talks about sin, right? Like, and all of that kind of, well, they get sucked into that world of let's believe this stuff, right? Who teaches it, who listens to it, who depends on it, who desperately needs that whole idea of sin, because then I can play that sin game, right? Of, okay, I did a sin or something, so what do I have to pay in order to to make that sin go away, right?
and even better, I get to say I'm wonderful and you're a sinner.
Oh, that's totally true. Then yeah, because I can blame you for all of my sins.
Well, and you see that in like if you go further on in the Genesis story, right? The woman says that, the man says it's the woman's fault. The woman says it's the serpent's fault. Like it's always
a blame game.
Fault, right?
Yeah, it's a blame game.
Do that quite a bit.
I want to ask Ruth another question, and it's similar to what we talked about in the Genesis story. Now that we're switching over to the gospel story. So you talked about how you would paint the Genesis story. How would you paint the temptation story?
How would I paint it? Never really thought about it, to be honest. How would I paint the temptation?
Would you paint it, or would you sculpt it, or would you weave it?
Oh, I would.
What would you do?
I would do a multimedia thing. I would probably incorporate all of the things that I have done and I would break it down to what is in my brain, the image that I would think of. And then I would do, part of it would be weaving. Part of it would be, I would probably include printmaking and weaving at that time. It'd probably be a sculpture. But I would I think it would be a multimedia because there's so many different layers, right? That, I mean, that's the thing about God. There's a ton of layers, right? And you have to peel back the layers to see the next layer, to see the next layer, to see the next layer. And that's what I really like about, and a lot of things that I do is there's different layers. So I probably use everything that I've got in my basket of tricks and do something really cool with that.
I know for me, the best representation I've ever seen of the temptation story comes from the movie The Miracle Maker.
Okay.
It's probably around the year 2000, Joanne, or thereabouts. I think that film came out.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
was a joint production between British filmmakers and I think Russian filmmakers at the time. And there
Okay.
were a lot of biblical scholars that were involved at the time. I think N.T. Wright might have even been involved as kind of technical consultants and stuff. But it's a really interesting film because it's predominantly done in claymation.
Okay.
But there are scenes. So anytime there's a flashback or a memory, it always goes to two-dimensional animation.
Oh, wow.
And so the scene of the temptation is two-dimensional animation, making us think that it's going on really inside Jesus's head, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the way that whole scene is portrayed in that film, I think is just beautiful, and the way that the devil is presented is just to me it just to me captures what the story really is about.
Okay, so what's the movie called?
The Miracle Maker.
Miracle Maker. Sorry, I'm now going to have to put that down on my technology.
And the other thought that I have about the gospel story is that not only is this a temptation for Jesus, and not only is it a temptation, for us as individuals, but it's also an institutional temptation, right? That the same things that Jesus is tempted with, the institution of the church has been, and I think still is being tempted by those things, right? The temptation of the kind of signs and wonders kind of thing, turning stones into bread, the idea of divine protection, the idea of like power, of ruling over the masses, controlling people, I think is something that the church needs to reflect on in the story as well. And the other artistic connection that I would make, and it only just popped into my head when we started this conversation now about the gospel story, is the scene from the novel The Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor, where Jesus, I think it's Dostoevsky's book, right? That's who wrote it. Yeah, where the Grand Inquisitor, Jesus comes back and he runs afoul of the church because he's doing what Jesus always did, which is go around, heal people, forgive sins, drink with sinners and that kind of stuff. And so they bring him in to say, you got to stop all this because there's basically a new sheriff in town now, right? We're in control, not you anymore. It's time for you to just disappear. We don't need you anymore, right? But that spoke to me of that idea of the institutional temptation that any institution faces, but in particular the church.
Yeah, the bigger you build it, the more people will come, right? That make the church or even larger building wise. Like the whole idea about church only being in a building is always fascinating me. It's like, sure, you have to build a building, and then Jesus and God will come, and I'm like, and now you don't need to build a building. It's just like, I find it fascinating, especially some churches feel that they need to make bigger churches. And that's really important because the bigger it's almost like the more toys you had, the easier time you're going to get to heaven. Right? It's that whole idea about, once again, consumerism, the whole idea about what you need, quote, what you need to get to someplace and whether or not you need it or not.
Yeah, and I think the fact too, because so much of what we do in the church, because we're a part of the culture, is centered around individualism, right? My own personal salvation, my own personal relationship with Jesus and with God, right? Whereas, I think when you interpret the Jesus story through the lens of the kingdom of God, or I like to call it the kingdom of God, right? It's not about power, it's about connection. It's about connection with each other, and it's about connection with God, and it's living in a different kind of way. And so, that there's still something radical about that. right? That it's not about me. It's not even about the church.
Yeah.
Right? This is the point. This is scandalous, I guess. We might get in trouble for saying things like this, but it's not about the church. It's about the kingdom of God, God's reign, right? Joanne
Yeah.
talked earlier about, the bringing glory to God, right? Still, so much of what we do in the church is about us.
Yeah.
And really, if we're we're made in the image of God, meant to reflect that image to the world, then we have to be plural. I mean, if we as Christians understand God as Trinity, then part of how God's self has revealed God's self to us is in community, right? Is in relationship already, right? So yeah, like we can't like I mean, I've often gotten students very confused by saying, like, I don't think individuals exist. Because, because we can't. Like, I can only even understand myself as an individual if I have someone else to compare myself with or against or whatever. That, we don't exist in singularity. And I mean, that's part of that Genesis story too, is, the notion that the Adam, the human one, couldn't exist in singularity.
Yeah.
And yeah, that like we need to be a relationship, and relationship is messy, but it doesn't make us unlovable to God. It doesn't, yeah. It's like when your kids comes out full of chocolate from their head to their toe. Like they might be a mess, but they're awful cute. You gotta take a picture before you cleans them up. You know, like it's that sort of thing, right? Where we're a holy mess, and that's
Well,
It's the
okay.
whole idea, it's the whole idea about who lifts us up, right? Like
Mm.
who stands behind us, who holds our hand
Mm.
to go on the adventure with us, right?
Right.
Be it friends, family, God, I mean, all of that kind of stuff. It is not about the individual, because really we are a mess. Without our friends and family and God, I mean, we are a mess. We're a mess anyway. We're just adding different
Well, it's
layers.
like you said, like we're never alone,
No, we're never.
and we never have to hide.
Mhm.
Um, we never have to hide that, that's yeah, we don't. I have a friend who really, I've got the BS in front of me. And I had a friend who really always used to love um the the open to you, all hearts are open, all desires known. From you, no secrets are hid. That was her favorite line of all the prayers. She's always hated it because that's an optional prayer, then people wouldn't say it, because she said that was the line that always got her, that knowledge that God knew there was nothing, no secret she could hide from God.
Mhm.
God loved her anyway.
Yeah,
That was the most powerful thing for her, right? Yeah.
I agree.
yeah, and I think from both these stories, I mean, things we take away from these stories about God, right? That God is creative. And if
Mhm.
we're made in the image of God, well, then we're creative too. We're not just consumers, right?
Yeah.
It's not just
The
about
makers.
right? It's not about
Oh, yeah.
having. I love that line from that Herbert O'Driscoll song about being God's co-creators. I mean,
Mhm.
that's just a beautiful, beautiful line, right? And the other thing too is that God is relational, or I would even go so far. God is relationship, or God is community. That certainly comes out in a Christian understanding of God, where God is three, right? Not just one. Um, God enters into relationship. God is covenantal. God is incarnational. God comes close, right? So why we get hung up on this transcendent separateness of God and our kind of, sin and dirtiness and unworthiness, to
Mhm.
me, just, we miss so much beauty in the story when we start off that way. And how different would Lent be if we start from that perspective of remembering who we are, right? And then continue the journey that way.
Because I always find it fascinating when people talk about creativity. Oh, I don't have a creative bone in my body. I said, oh, you'd be surprised. Because I think what you think of as my creativity is my creativity. Your creativity is something completely different. And you have creativity in you. You just need to figure out where it is sitting, where it is standing, where it is, in order for you to discover it. And I always find it fascinating when people say, I don't have a creative bone in my body. And all I could think of, yes, you do. Right.
Well, our time is running out, and so we always like to pair these conversations and the readings with some of the alternative collects from the Anglican Church of Canada, and to bring another layer to our conversation and to the way we approach these scriptures. So the collect that we've chosen for this week says, Spirit of the desert, you drove Jesus to the edge of the world to seek your truth and find his calling. Scour our hearts and awaken our hunger, so that freed from empty clinging, we may serve only you, the Creator, through Jesus Christ, the Lord of the wilds. Beautiful. Amen.
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 Yeah, certainly picking up on some of the themes we talked about. So thank you so much, Ruth. This has been a lot of fun. And I know we could probably go on for a long
Well, I
time.
have class to go to, so it doesn't work like that today.
We certainly appreciate you taking time to be with us. So, and we hope everyone
Thank you for
who's
asking me.
watching,
Yeah.
that this is helpful and can help you to read these Lenten readings with the eyes of an artist. Take care, everyone. See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.